All right, welcome everybody to our second in a series. If you can hear me, give us a thumbs up or pop in the chat just to make sure we are all good to go. We're very glad to have you joining us today. All right. And for those of you who join us again after last week, welcome back. We have even more wonderful field science for you today as well. All right. So as I said, welcome, and this is the second in a very special lecture series. My name is Paige Engelbrechtson, and with me off screen is my coworker, Meaghan Gade. We work for the Highlands Biological Foundation, which supports natural history research and education in the Southern Appalachians. I'm proud to say that the foundation has directly supported our speaker today because a key topic for both research and education is climate change. In order to address this topic more directly, we are broadening our program to include this new lecture series. For the next 2 weeks, we will be inviting field researchers who have worked in the region to share their findings and related research and what it suggests for how climate change has been, is, or may impact our area. Throughout this presentation, please feel free to leave comments and questions in the chat and Q&A. After the presentation, Meaghan and I will be moderating a Q&A session for the remainder of our time together. And while I don't expect it will be an issue, I do want to say up front that as we are an organization that supports the science, we believe the science. Climate change is a reality, and we are not here to debate this. Instead, the questions before us are: what impacts will it have, and how can we mitigate it? Our book club this past year addressed the second question, and this series aims to answer the first. As part of this, please join me in welcoming Dr. Meaghan Gade to the webinar. Dr. Gade graduated from Auburn University with a bachelor's in zoology and conservation and went on to complete her master's degree at John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, where she studied poison frog behavior and evolution. She has spent the last 5 years working on her PhD at Ohio State University, where she had the opportunity to spend 4 field seasons at Highlands studying plethodon salamanders. She graduated in May and is heading to the Yale University to begin a postdoctoral fellowship to continue working on salamanders. Dr. Meaghan Gade, welcome.
Thank you so much, Paige. Let me get this presentation going, and all good, you can't hear me? Wait, sorry.
Yeah, me too. All right, everybody, if you can hear Meaghan, let us know. It looks like our internet here at the Nature Center may be having a hot moment. You all may hear her just fine, though.
Can everybody hear me?
The wonders of rural internet, of course.
Yeah,
all right,
okay.
Brilliant. Meaghan, take it away.
Okay, we'll catch up. Sorry, guys, you don't get to hear. All right, let me get this going here. All right. Well, thank you, Paige and Winter. I'm sorry that you guys can't hear right now. Hopefully that'll be fixed in a second. But I'm so excited to be talking to this group of people in particular, because like Paige said, I had the opportunity to work at Highlands for the past 4 summers, actually, while I was working on my PhD research. During that time, not only did I get to build a relationship with the station, but also with the community in the town of Highlands. And Highlands is such a special place for so many different reasons. But one of the sort of reason that's sort of closest to my heart is that it actually resides it's called this region of the salamander capital of the world. Highlands is this incredible doorway into all things salamanders. Nowhere on Earth are there as many salamander species as there are in the Southern Appalachians. And because of that, there's been so many incredible researchers that have come through Highlands to study salamanders. And today I really want to highlight a lot of that amazing research that has been done over the past 10 or so years from people who have passed through Highlands, either as people like me who were grant and aid recipients and did their entire PhD research at a Highlands, or some people who just sort of passed through. But a lot of this research that I'm going to talk about today, again, from people who did their work at Highlands, have really laid a lot of the groundwork for our current understanding of how salamanders might be affected by climate change. So when I talk about salamanders today, and all the salamander talk will be about salamanders in the genus Plethodon. This is a woodland salamander group. They're completely terrestrial. There's no aquatic life stage. And like I mentioned, they have their entire, their highest biodiversity in the Southern Appalachian Mountains. So this map shows the distribution of Plethodon species across the world. And you can see this nice little hotspot right where Highlands is. And so there's more species anywhere else, nowhere else in the world than here. And if we were to zoom into that region, we see that in that Western North Carolina region and Southern Virginia is where we're really seeing the primary hotspot. Now, why is that? Why are there so many salamanders in the Southern Appalachians? One of the primary reasons is, and one of the coolest things about these salamanders is that they're actually lungless. So these salamanders do not have lungs, and because of that, they have to live in really cool and moist environments because they breathe through their skin. So they have to keep their skin moist and cool so that gas exchange can occur. Now, why do we care about salamanders? Why am I talking so much about salamanders? Well, number one, they just have this incredible abundance. There's so many salamanders. If you go out on the trails at Highlands, on a really rainy night, you're gonna have to watch your step and watch what you're leaning up against because there's probably a salamander there. In fact, if we look at the distribution of total number of salamanders, so total number of individuals across just an elevational gradient, we can see that at lower elevations, around 1,000 meters, and moving up in elevation, we get more and more salamanders. That's because as we go up in elevation, temperatures really cool off, and it gets a lot more moist. That's why everyone, retreats to Highlands for the summers, right? It gets a whole lot cooler up here than somewhere like Atlanta. No one wants to be down there in the summer. Salamanders have figured that out already, and they've been hanging out up in these Appalachian regions for millions of years. So like I mentioned, these salamanders are lungless. And this has been a really great evolutionary benefit for these salamanders, primarily because it reduces the energetic demands of these salamanders. So not only do they not have to worry about putting energy into growing their lungs, but they also don't need to worry about putting energy into maintenance or respiration. If you think about, as we breathe, we're inhaling and we're exhaling, that takes a certain amount of energy, and salamanders don't have to worry about that. Instead, how they sort of manage their respiration, their cutaneous respiration, is through capillary bed regression and regeneration. So they have a number of capillaries on the surface of their skin, or just under the surface of the skin, that they can regenerate and regress depending on how much they need to be conserving water and exchanging oxygen. This has been an incredible evolutionary benefit for these salamanders. So these salamanders are over 100 million years old. And they really haven't changed a whole lot. And they've completely proliferated in their diversity in these colder, more temperate regions like the Southern Appalachians. Now, unfortunately, we are faced with anthropogenic climate change that's happening at a rate that we've never seen in the past. And even more, unfortunately, the Southern Appalachians are they're no different from any other part. So just about a year ago, the North Carolina Climate Science Report was released, and they gave projections for how they expect climate change to influence the Western North Carolina mountain region. So I'm going to show you a couple of graphs to show you what this report estimated. And what you'll see is we have year on the x-axis, and there's going to be a lot of different graphs here, so different climate variables on the y-axis. The black line indicates what we've observed already, right, because that goes into the past. And then these two different colored polygons represent our projections in the future under different carbon emission scenarios. So the red is our higher carbon emission scenario. Essentially, if we don't curb any of our emissions, that's what's going to happen. That's the projections. If we do curb, we'll be closer to this RCP 4.5, that lower emission scenario. So what this first graph is showing us is sort of what we expect, that over time, temperatures are going to increase. But not only are sort of the broad temperatures going to increase, we're actually going to see more warm days. So this is the number of days where we have a maximum temperature exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and we see an increase over time. Not only that, not only hot days, but also we're going to see warmer nights and warmer winters. So this is the number of days with the minimum temperature of greater than 70 degrees. Now, this could be particularly bad for salamanders because they are nocturnal. They emerge and become surface active when it cools off at night, because it's going to be cooler at night always. And so this could actually be really bad for the salamanders. When we look at precipitation, it's kind of hard to see a trend here, and that's because it's actually really hard to predict how rainfall and precipitation is going to change in the future. But the biggest thing we can notice here is how big and wide these polygons are. So we can predict that we're going to have more variable rainfall events into the future. But also, it just keeps compounding. We're also going to expect more extreme rainfall events. So this is the number of days with more than 3 inches of rain. So all of this, warmer temperatures, hotter days, hotter nights, more variable and more extreme weather events. This is what's projected for the Southern Appalachian region. So how is this going to impact climate change? One of the first studies to really empirically look at this was Milanovic et al. In 2010. This is a group of researchers. One of the et al. Researchers was my PhD advisor, a really fantastic group of salamander researchers. But what we have here, what this group did was they used correlative niche models to estimate the climate niche. So essentially where in the climate space does a salamander live? And then they projected that over time. And so what you can see here, this sort of sea cucumber shaped looking thing here is actually just this polygon of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And the colors represent species richness. And so this is present day. This is how many species that we do see present day based on the climate niche of the salamander. So this is essentially based on suitable habitat and suitable climate. As we move into the future, in 2050, we're expecting especially the southernmost portion species to go extinct. And then as we go further into the future, 2080, we see even more black on this map indicating even more loss of species, especially in that southern portion and the lower elevation regions. In fact, this research team estimated that every salamander species currently extant in the Southern Appalachians are going to experience a restriction in their climate habitat with climate change. So this was a pretty pivotal study in the climate change and salamander world. And these correlative niche models are really helpful and popular to use to project climate change effects. But there's a lot of different sort of aspects that you can look at to understand how wildlife broadly can affect climate change. So we can focus on habitat like this study did, but there's other things we can look at like behavior. So some of the work that I did for my dissertation was looking at how climate change is going to affect salamander surface activity. Why surface activity? It's a fantastic proxy for fitness in this group. Like I mentioned, these animals only emerge at night when conditions are good. And it's only when they're surface active can they engage in these fitness related behaviors like eating, which contributes to growth, and mating. They only do those things when they're surface active. So if we're able to measure surface activity and then predict that into the future, it might give us a good idea of how the fitness of these animals will turn out. So we did this using the Plethodon jordanized species complex. This is a complex of species of Plethodon that basically all look alike. They just have red on different parts of their body. And pretty much the only way you know what species you're looking at is to know what mountaintop you're standing on. So these polygons here represent the geographic ranges. You can see that the species don't have a ton of overlap. And so they're considered, so they're geographically distinct, and they also all live on mountaintops. So they're called sky island species because these mountaintops, they're restricted to that because they can't disperse in those warmer lowlands. So they're just kind of stuck in the sky on these sky islands. So what we did was we took data going all the way back to 2004 from where these little symbols are. So we had a couple of different data sets, and we wanted to figure out what climate covariates or weather covariates are driving surface activity today. Once we figure that out, we can project that into the future. So the six climate covariates that we found to be driving surface activity today, to be the strongest, were 1 day and 3 day total precipitation, 1 day and 3 day average temperature, VPA, which is vapor pressure, or how much water is in the air, and the number of dry days. So we figured that out. We figured out that these are sort of the 6 primary things that are driving salamander activity. And then we projected that into the future. So you can see that these graphs are actually showing these estimates through time. And like I mentioned, these precipitation covariates, you don't see a whole lot of trend there, right? That goes back to what I was saying, that you can't really predict. It's really hard to predict precipitation in the future, but we see nice, clear, positive trends in temperature and VPA. So what we did then was predict the probability of surface activity, knowing that this is what the future climate is going to look like. And this is what we found. So the colors here represent the probability of surface activity. And we see in 2020, this is our current estimation of probability of surface activity. And interestingly, you'll see that the colors get more and more red, so that we expect them to become more surface active as we move in time. But that's a little bit contradictory to what I've been telling you, right? So I'm saying salamanders only come out when it's wet and when it's hot, but now we know that temperatures are getting warmer and the salamanders are coming out. What we think is going on here, as temperatures rise, metabolic rate increases. This is a pattern seen across all species. As metabolic rate increases, you need to eat more to counteract that metabolic cost or expense. So we think that these animals are going to be forced to become surface active under hotter temperatures, given their metabolic rate. Now, I think it's really important to note here that in this study, we didn't actually assess any sort of physiology. We were just looking at this probability to surface activity. I do now want to sort of transition into talking about how salamander physiology will respond to climate change, because these salamanders are lungless. This is sort of their keystone thing about them. Everyone says, unique lungless anatomy. And strangely enough, salamander physiology is really understudied. There's only been a couple of work. There was a lot of work back in like the 40s where, research back in the 40s was great and foundational, but we have a lot of tools today to be a little bit more powerful. And so because this has been really understudied, potentially we're really missing out on this dimension of physiology to be as a potential thing to help them succeed with climate change. Now, as with everything, physiology is complicated. There's a lot of different things that compose physiology. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. I first want to start with talking about salamander stress. Stress in animals is typically a really great way to measure how healthy an animal is, because stress can interact with other vital processes. So think about when you're really stressed out, you might be more prone to getting ill because your body says, I don't need to put energy into my immune system right now. I need to deal with this stressor. And so if we can look at if we can quantify salamander stress, we might have a good idea of the general health of these animals. One of the really cool aspects of this study, this was another part of my dissertation work, was that we came up with a new way to actually measure salamander stress. So previously you would either have to sacrifice the whole animal or get blood draws, which is impossible on these slimy, sticky creatures. So we actually came up with a way to just swab the back of a salamander, just like with a Q-tip basically. And then we're able to extract the stress hormone out of that. So we brought a whole bunch of salamanders in from the field and brought them back to Highlands. And we acclimated them to laboratory conditions. And then we exposed them to one of 4 conditions. We exposed them to hot temperatures, we exposed them to dry temperatures, and then we exposed them to the combination of hot and dry conditions. And those are all what we would expect would be really stressful climate conditions for salamanders. We also had a control group. So this is where we just kept them at their acclimation conditions for the duration of the experiment. So we held them at these conditions for about 6 or 7 days, and then we took a post-exposure swab, and we wanted to see what the difference was after they were exposed to that stressor. This is what my experiment looked like. I completely overtook all of the environmental chambers in Coker, and I had about 400 salamanders at a given time. Each one of these containers has an adorable salamander in it. But of course, the station was incredibly helpful with, when they broke or whatever. And I'm so jealous because I think that the environmental chambers are getting updated or replaced right now. And oh, that would have been nice, but it worked out great. And the experiment was really, really interesting. So let me show you what we found. So here on the x-axis, we have our treatments. And here on the y-axis, this is delta D cort, so our difference between the post-exposure and the pre-exposure swab. And first, let me show you the control. So this is what we're comparing everything against. And the letters above the bars represent statistical significance. If the letters are the same, then they're not statistically different. And if the letters are different, they are statistically different. So this is the control. This is what we found in our dry treatment. We actually saw that salamanders downregulated their stress response when they were exposed to dry conditions. In hot conditions, we didn't see any difference in their stress response. But the really interesting part happened when we look at the difference in the hot and dry conditions. We see this massive increase in salamander stress when they're exposed to both of those stressful conditions. So there might be a couple of things going on here. Number one, the stress hormone might be playing a role in water loss resistance. So these salamanders might downregulate their cort. That might tell, the capillaries to restrict so that we're not losing as much water. There could be some underlying physiological processes, and that's something that I'm going to be diving into later. Would love to talk about it if anyone has questions about it. With the hot conditions, maybe we didn't make it hot enough. Perhaps they're just okay with it. Perhaps as long as it's wet, they can deal with the hot. But what seems to be happening here is that they cannot compensate their physiological response when there's multiple stressors. And this could be really bad, especially with those projections of climate change of it getting hotter and potentially more drought years, right? So if we have that variable precipitation. But it's really interesting because these salamanders do have this amazing ability to adapt, really. If we look at salamanders across the whole group, across the whole tree of Plethodon, what this is showing, this is soil temperature and relative to humidity. So just think of it as temperature and wetness. And these are different groups of salamanders. So, Plethodon cinereus has X amount of species in it. There's the cinereus group has X amount of species. All I want you to take away from this is that salamanders in some groups are better able to live in warm and moist microhabitats, while other salamanders can live in cool and dry. So it doesn't always have to be cool and wet. It seems like there can be some level of trade-off. And even within a group, I want to show you these. What these are showing you. This is the evolutionary tree of salamanders. Don't worry about that. We'll look at the colors. What these colors are showing you is what microhabitat these animals are looking at. And let me draw your attention to two species in particular. So Plethodon teahali and Plethodon metcalfi. These are found, these are the gray cheek salamanders, metcalfi is that you find all over at the station. And then Plethodon teahali is a low elevation salamander. And they're actually elevational replacements of each other. So at low elevations, you'll see Plethodon teahali. As you go up in elevation, you stop seeing teahali and you start seeing metcalfi. And you can see here that Plethodon teahali, again, that low elevation species that lives in those hotter conditions, tends to be in wetter conditions, but much warmer conditions. So this is temperature, this is humidity on the left here. Now, when we look at metcalfi, these animals are living in much warmer microhabitats, much cooler microhabitats relative to Plethodon teahali, but they can be in slightly drier conditions. So we have this sort of trade-off of different conditions so that they can moderate their physiology. This work was done by Vinny Ferralla, who made many trips through Highlands, and his postdoc advisor is my future postdoc advisor. So this is some work that I'm going to be really diving into in my postdoc here in the future. But this system of teahali and metcalfi is really interesting, and that's because this system, they actually hybridize. So I mentioned that at high elevations, we tend to see Plethodon metcalfi. Now, metcalfi is one of those Plethodon jordani complex. So we can use Plethodon shermani as an example, and it's the same thing. But at high elevations above 1,000 meters, we see the red-legged salamanders. At low elevations, we see this really chunky Plethodon teahali. It's quite a bit bigger than Plethodon shermani. And then at mid elevations where they actually overlap, they hybridize. So introgression means they mate with each other, and they essentially make offspring that look like an exact intermediate between the parent species. And this is a really interesting system. This happens all over the Southern Appalachians with different Plethodon species that are elevational replacements of each other. I'm really interested in this, and I think it's a really interesting system to think about with the context of climate change for a couple of different reasons. Number one, well, first of all, this work, the first person to actually look at this stuff was Hairston et al. In 1992, and they looked from a period of 1974 to 1992 at the proportion of pure Plethodon shermani at a given elevation. And they found that over time, we see less and less pure shermani, indicating more and more hybridization. And this is at the same elevation. Walls in 2009 did a follow-up study and essentially attributed this decline in pure shermani with temperature. So remember, those Plethodon teahalis, those low-level animals, are pre-adapted to those warmer conditions. So they can actually move up in elevation as climate change warms from the bottom up, and they can start hybridizing with shermani. And then that might make shermani capable of giving them a couple of genes that makes them better at dealing with these hotter conditions. Some of the work that I did for my dissertation, we used a mercury capture study, and we actually found that hybrids have a higher survival probability than pure Plethodon shermani. So this is the hybrid. If you're a hybrid, you had a more positive hybrid score. So not only are we seeing this hybrid zone increase in elevation, but it seems like the hybrids are surviving better. And that might be because teahali is better adapted to living in these warmer conditions. You're going to see a lot of work coming out on this hybridization stuff through some of my work, but also John Mayer's out of Coweta. They have a 30-year data set that's on hybridization, and they're starting to publish on it, and it's really exciting. So keep an eye out for that if this excites you. Another aspect of Plethodon physiology specifically is water loss resistance and acclimation. So salamanders, right, they want to keep water in. As long as they have water and they're not dehydrated, they can stay surface active. As soon as they get a certain amount of dehydration, they'll retreat back to under their underground burrows. So if they can stay water resistant and stay hydrated, they can stay on the surface longer, and that's better. They can eat more, they have more opportunities to mate. So looking at water loss resistance is really important. Eric Riddell did a fantastic seminal work on some of this physiology. He was looking at Plethodon metcalfi, and he was looking at water loss resistance of these species across their elevational range. Let me walk you through this graph here. What we have is elevation on the x-axis and water loss resistance on the y-axis. Eric brought animals into the lab and exposed them to either 12 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Celsius, and then measured their water loss resistance. Generally, we can see that animals from lower elevations at both temperatures, remember lower elevations are warmer, had higher water loss resistance. So if it's warmer, these salamanders are able to regulate their water loss resistance and keep water in. And then as we go up in elevation, they tend to get less and less water loss resistance because they don't need to employ any sort of physiology because it's pretty wet and cool up at those higher elevations. The really interesting part here is when we look at the difference between the two treatments. So salamanders that were exposed to much hotter temperatures had much higher water loss resistance rates than those at the lower temperature. And so this gives us some indication that salamanders are really good at adapting and acclimating to their condition. So depending on what they're experiencing, they can actually modify a lot of their behavior. Eric then took some of this knowledge and he said, okay, we know that salamanders can modify their physiology. How is that going to play out in the context of climate change? So Eric did a series of really sophisticated biophysical models where you're incorporating a lot of different things that you know about salamanders to understand their net energy balance. So how much energy are they putting into certain processes and how much are they gaining? And he did this model in 3 different ways. First, he did a no acclimation. So this is essentially saying salamanders don't change their physiology. They're always the same, no matter what the conditions are. They're not going to modify. And you can see that over time, and the colors here represent net energy balance. You can see that over time, we have not only essentially less area for salamanders to be living, but as we move through time, we're getting more and more red, right? So that's more negative energy balance. So that's not super great for salamanders, but we know that they do acclimatize. So he ran a model saying these salamanders will adjust their physiology and their water loss resistance given the conditions. And you can see not only is there more area that the salamanders can actually have some net energy balance, but we see much less red and actually a little bit more green as we move into the future. That's because as we go on, temperatures get hotter, salamanders can adjust that water loss resistance rates. But there was one more aspect to this that was really interesting. I've talked about that salamanders will go underground and only emerge when the conditions are right. So we know that they actually have some behavioral modifications they can make. Often if you're out at night and you're kind of just looking around, you'll see a little salamander sticking its head out of the burrow. What it's doing is it's checking. It's saying, is this a good temperature for me to come out? And if it's not, they go right back in. If it seems to be a good temperature, they'll become surface active. So not only will they physiologically modify, but they'll behaviorally modify to better use their environment. So that's what this model looks like. Here you can see that there's way more green, way more positive net energy balance when we incorporate these 2 things that we now know that salamanders do. And this is a way better story and outcome for salamanders into the future. So this is some really great research. And again, this is going to be some work that we're going to further in some of the postdoc work that I'll be doing. Okay, so overall, I've tried to convince you that, plethodons are going to be impacted by climate change through their geographic ranges, through their behaviors, through their physiologies. All of those things are going to be impacted, but there's not necessarily in a negative way. They're going to have, these animals seem to have multiple strategies for counteracting climate change effects, including hybridization, acclimatization, avoidance, and using different habitats. Now, unfortunately, climate change favors species that have wide thermal tolerance. So a species that can live in really hot and really warm, that's a much better species for climate change. Short generation time, so they reproduce a lot and they don't have a long life. And a range of genotypes and high adaptive capacity. Unfortunately, salamanders don't have any of those things. Salamanders live a really long time. Actually, John Mayers out of UGA at Coweta, just a couple of days ago, so they have this long-term mercury capture study. So they found this salamander, this is Plethodon teahali. They first captured this animal in 2011, and it was 6 years old when they caught him. They caught them May 13th, 2021. This animal is 17 years old. This is the longest recorded, and recorded is Twitter, but Twitter is like the new science, so it's fine. But this is the longest recorded lifespan of a plethodonid salamander, and this is not unique. There are other long-term studies that are suggesting that these animals live a really long time. That could be bad for salamanders because they're not reproducing every year. So they might be skipping some really good years to reproduce and get their genes out there to change and adapt to climate change. So while these salamanders have a lot of amazing capacity to deal with climate change, they do have some inherent things about their biology that might make it a little bit tricky, but there's just so much more that we need to figure out. So what can you do? Get outside, especially at night. The trails at Highlands, they're completely packed with salamanders. Hit up the salamander meander. It starts June 1st. You can reach out to Paige or Winter, go to the website to get more information. There's a registration, so make sure you do that to go there. But this is a fantastic opportunity to get sort of a guided tour of the salamanders of Highlands. And if it's a nice wet night, it's going to be fantastic. Another thing you can do is tell your friends about salamanders. I found that People ask me what my research is, and I tell them I study salamanders, and people have no idea what a salamander is. So just educating people about salamanders, letting them know about the incredible diversity and all they can do for our forest is really, really important. From a more practical perspective, when you're on a hike, look for salamanders. They're pretty easy to find, especially up in Highlands. I would recommend and ask that you don't touch them too much, right? These salamanders breathe through their skin, so we don't need, our oils of our fingers getting into those, into their skin. Also, don't make Karens. This is like a bit of a personal vendetta I have. So Karens are those rock formations that you see, and people like to build them. It's fine, but it's actually really bad for salamanders and wildlife in general, right? A salamander might be using the space under that rock as their home, and now you've just moved them and disrupted a lot. So let's not do Karens, and always replace rocks and logs to where you found them. That's going to be, easy things you can do to really ensure conservation of these species with their somewhat unknown fate with climate change. So that's all I have for you. I'll stop talking at you, but I really want to get some of your questions and speak with you guys some more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Meaghan. You could probably see Winter and I are like really engrossed in the science portion of that. And so I hope that everybody else enjoyed as well. And please do put your questions and comments in either the chat or the Q&A. We did have a request from Evan, who was asking, could you review the definition of surface activity again?
Yeah, sure. So surface activity is just basically what it sounds. So these animals, they're living in underground burrows. And it's just when they come to the surface out of their burrow and start engaging in moving, foraging, mating. So it's just literally when they become active on the surface. I hope that answers the question.
I think so. And one thing that I noticed personally was in the slide where you were showing the projected species richness in the Southern Appalachians. It was very alarming to see that black space continue to grow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting, it's at those really southern parts and at the lowest elevation. That's where we're really going to start heating up.
I think my question for you is interpreting, like based on what you were saying about the lowland salamanders having the potential to advance up, does this map specifically reflect the Southern Appalachian salamanders we have now, and it doesn't reflect the intrusion or the arrival of salamanders moving up the mountain?
It does. This model doesn't incorporate any sort of dispersal events or hybridization events. It's just essentially what habitat is available to them in the future. And if they don't change anything, is that same habitat going to be available to them in the future?
You mentioned dispersal and how for the Sky Island salamanders, those valleys were impassable. Do you anticipate that like our species that we have here in the very southern won't be able to move north fast enough to keep up and be represented in these future maps?
It's a good question. Short answer, we don't know. Salamanders are actually very poor dispersers. These animals tend to live their entire life in a 2.5, 3 square meter region. And their dispersal is very, very slow. So the reason we have so many species in the mountains is essentially, as we had ice ages coming through, and this is happening over millions and millions of years, but the glaciers come through, they get pushed up, and as they recede, it's cool enough for them to move down the mountain, but then they get pushed back up. And this is happening over millions and millions of years. And that's why we're getting so many different species. The rate of climate change is so fast that there's a very good chance, given what we know about these species biology and their pretty much unwillingness and inability to move quickly, could be really, really detrimental. It's a topic of a lot of research right now because it's really important. There's been some work looking at a smaller species of plethodon called Plethodon cinereus, which has a really large geographic range going all the way from Canada down to basically the Southern Appalachians. Over about 100 years, they have moved latitudinally, but at a very, very small rate, and that's not equivalent to the rates of climate change right now. So it's a little bit of bad news on that end.
A little bit, I think is probably putting it lightly.
Yes, yeah.
But speaking of research that has been done over years, Karen Patterson says, excellent talk, always looking for ways to justify salamander research. Where can you see your research going that convinces people salamander research is important?
Oh, it's an excellent question. So I think knowing that these salamanders contribute so much to ecosystem function, they're obviously important. There's so many of them. I think research that really gets out the sort of coolness of the animals, so that the fact that they are able to acclimate. So that work that Eric Riddell did was incredible research. It got a lot of press because people didn't know that that these salamanders had the capacity to do that. I think doing meaningful work, I'm really interested on this physiology side of things and really trying to dive into what is their capacity to change, and really focusing in on just sort of like the flashy parts of salamanders. But in my opinion, you don't need a whole lot of flashiness for these animals. They're lungless and they've lived for 100 million years. It's pretty incredible. That was a very terrible answer to your question, but I'm going to leave it at that.
I like to call salamanders the charismatic microfauna of the Southern Appalachians, because I've yet to meet somebody who, sees one of our salamanders and goes, ah!
Yes,
they're always wanting to get up close and personal with them.
Absolutely. That's so great. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to tie in one of the things that our presenter from last week mentioned.
Sure.
He was demonstrating with birds that they've shown that the variability in precipitation is huge. You get years where there's a lot of rain, you get years where there's very little rain. Mm-hmm. And he was tying that specifically to the birds. But I'm curious about how, we had the drought in 2016. This year, the eastern half of the state is already heading towards drought status. Are those really dry, really wet years, let alone how much rain is coming at one time, going to be huge for salamanders?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So it absolutely impacts. So we know that on really wet years, these animals tend to grow at a much faster rate, and they tend to reproduce more as well. So those will be the years that we see or essentially the year after a really wet year, we'll see a huge influx of baby salamanders. And so and that probably goes to the conditions that we have. So it's really wet, and it doesn't matter what the weather is. If it's super wet, they can become surface active, they can be foraging, and then they're growing. So we know that has an influence. There's been a lot of really great work by Grant Kennett, who did his dissertation out of Highlands, looking at those effects. Fortunately, those salamanders can actually live underground. They don't necessarily need to become surface active. If there's a drought summer, and we actually saw this in 2016, like you mentioned, with some of the wildfires. The wildfires came through during, October-ish. And so this is during their inactive season. So these animals escaped sort of direct mortality from the fires, and then they didn't come out that summer. But then the following summer, we saw a reemergence of adults. So what we think is happening is that they can actually just kind of hang out underground for as long as they need to. I don't think they could hang out underground indefinitely, but for a good amount of time to avoid some of those really harsh conditions. So it's completely dependent on sort of the time frame of that, and but the periodicity of rainfall is definitely a really important thing when it comes to salamanders.
We'll see what that ends up shaking out to be.
Yeah.
We do have Evan, who is inviting you. He's saying, I'd like to hear more about how salamanders contribute to ecosystem functioning and services.
Yeah, absolutely. So these salamanders, they first and foremost eat a lot of invertebrates. And so they are some level of pest control, but then that also helps with nutrient cycling. So the invertebrates want to eat the leaf litter and break that down. But with the salamanders eating them, that slows that decomposition rate down, which can be really important for just general health of a forest. The other really cool thing they do, so these animals while they live underground, they tend to be using burrows that have been abandoned by another animal. So like a beetle or something. Plethodons they're not good diggers. They're not going to be digging their own burrow, but what they do is they can keep an existing burrow open. And the importance of those burrows is it's sort of like an aeration of your lawn. It keeps it open. It allows airflow, and it allows nutrients to deposit into the soil much easier than if we just had this really impervious surface of the soil. There's some really cool work looking at salamander burrows where you can like essentially mold the burrow out, and some of them are cavernous, and they can make like little homes. Again, that the Plethodon are not doing that. There's other species of salamanders or other genuses of salamanders, like the spotted salamander, the marbled salamanders. They are actually really good diggers, and they play a really big role in that, even more so than Plethodon, because Plethodon's just kind of keeping everything open. They're not really making new burrows.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Meaghan. I actually wanted to pop on with a question of my own. So you were talking about the hybrids between the lower and higher elevation species. And I was wondering, like, can these hybrids reproduce, or are they sterile?
No, they're fully reproductive. We have the group down at Coweta, they see, F4, F5 generation. So they're reproductive. They're really good at surviving. Like I showed that graph that they have higher survival probability. One of the things that I know the group down in Coweta is working on is to get an idea of what generation these hybrids are, and to see if they're sort of like how much mixing there is going on genetically, and if that leads to higher reproduction or lower reproduction. We don't know if they're less reproductive than a pure. So perhaps while they can reproduce, maybe it's only about half of what one of the pure parents would do. That's just something we don't know yet.
Gotcha. And do you see these hybrids creating like a lot of competition for like the higher elevation species?
Excellent question. We don't know. That's a really, really good question, because those hybrid animals are bigger, so they're better competitors. And so if if we're sort of at the leading edge of the hybrid zone, and so they're meeting sort of pure high elevation species, not only does that high elevation species have to deal with sort of an invasion, but also they might be competitive, like just outmatched competitively, which is what the expectation would be, but we just don't know right now. It's a great, great question.
And I think, if I'm not mistaken, John Maris is actually one of our honor lecture speakers this summer.
Oh, great. That's awesome. If
I have the right person in mind, everybody will be able to learn more about that, which is exciting.
Yeah, he has an incredible research program on salamanders, and that's definitely a great talk to go to.
Very topical for this area.
Yes, definitely.
I wanted to just, and this is admittedly a personal question, you mentioned the capillaries for breathing through their skin for the plethodons. So they're not just reducing the capillary size, they're actually reducing the number of capillaries in their skin.
As we understand it, yes. Yeah, they can actually create new and get rid of old capillaries. As we understand it, it's still early work. It's been published. It's all genetic work right now, but that's how we understand it right now. Yeah.
In a lot of science fiction stories, they talk about like regenerating limbs and other cool animal traits. Do you think there's anything that like salamanders do that maybe we could learn from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So salamanders have actually been used for a really long time in biomedical research because of their ability to regenerate limbs. There was actually a group, and I'm forgetting the name. Sorry, I realize I'm still sharing screen. Should I take that off? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there was a research group that came through, and they were studying regeneration in salamanders, and they found that a salamander can lose up to 2/3 of their heart, survive, and then regrow their heart. It's unbelievable. And these salamanders can lose multiple limbs. They can lose their tail, and they'll regrow. So we have salamanders, and they regrow quite quickly. So there's salamanders that we've taken tail tips for a tissue sample to get DNA off of. And the next year we'll capture that same salamander and it's already regrown. They have this super, super quick regeneration cells, and it's a hot topic in biomedical research to study how they're actually doing that. Another thing that salamanders are used for that, for biomedical research, is especially in those slimy salamanders, so Plethodon teohalis, they're really sticky. So if you touch them, they secrete this sticky stuff, like to the point where your fingers are super glued. And so there's a lot of research looking into the components that make up that stickiness to use as potential sutures for internal and external use on humans.
I mean, I think some of our naturalists had a close encounter with one of those sticky salamanders. They went out learning some of the salamanders in our botanical garden, still had the goo a day later.
You also, you can't get it off. Soap doesn't work. Alcohol doesn't work. It's just, you're just stuck with it until it just kind of like rubs off your hands. It's pretty terrible.
I guess
I always tell people if they get the stickiness, immediately stick your hands in dirt and then just get dirt to stick in the sticky, because then at least you won't stick it to yourself.
I have a friend who, you get a scratch, he says, rub dirt in it. So about the same advice.
Same advice, yeah.
But I think we were speaking to the biomedical research also speaks to Karen's question about why salamanders are worth conserving or looking into.
Absolutely.
We talk all the time. There's often talk about like finding new antibiotics and learning from traditional ecological knowledge and finding the resources in nature to answer the problems before us. So maybe one of the cases that we could make for researching and conserving salamanders is we never know what Plethodon species or what salamander species might have the answer for us for that.
For us to learn from. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. Paige, I think you're muted.
Very good at that. All right. So I would invite anybody else who has thoughts or questions to please share them, because I know I have been monopolizing the space a little. But I think I've managed to run out of most of the questions I have.
Okay.
So,
yeah.
But yeah, no, Meaghan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fantastic to have you on board again.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a pleasure being here. I really appreciate it.
Well, we look forward to maybe seeing you in the future.
Yes, absolutely.
And for everybody else, thank you all so much for joining us. Keep your fingers crossed that barring any technical issues, a recording of this webinar will be available next Monday on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to sign up for our final lecture, where we will be hearing about mountaintops in the Smokies and microclimates, so kind of the heat and the humidity that Meaghan was talking about today, you can learn more and sign up on our website. If you're interested in our general future programming, like our salamander meanders, you will hear about those first through our e-blast. So definitely make sure to sign up for those if you can. Registration is limited, so sign up, call early. And finally, if you'd like to support the foundation with its programming and its supported research, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. We really appreciate your support. Our thanks to Dr. Gade, and our thanks to you all for joining us. I hope I see you next week. Take care, all.